Native people don't really have a lot of visibility generally in this country and just globally because that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah.
Most indigenous communities have suffered from genocide, and all indigenous communities in North America have.
Yeah.
So we really need time for people to acknowledge us and do things for us, and it really sucks that it's only this month or only Indigenous Peoples Day. But I think that just having that little bit of people to be like, hey, they actually exist, and for institutions like universities and like even the school to recognize stuff like that, make sure that like people know we're not all dead.
Yes.
So Elazi is probably my favorite on this list, not because I think it's like the best written necessarily. I just think that it's really good, and it offers like an intersection of queerness and indigeneity, which isn't super common because it's like one thing to get an indigenous story out there, it's another thing to get a queer indigenous story out there. And the author is asexual, the main character is asexual, and you can kind of see it throughout the book. But that's like not the main point of the book. It talks a lot more about like indigenous ways of teaching and community.
Yeah.
So I think the most important bit about like the way that magic, I guess, works in this book is that for Elatsoe, her power is passed down through like teaching, which is really important to me because I think a lot of times settlers get this idea in their head that indigenous like self, like who you are as an indigenous person, is all about like, oh, this is biologically my father, oh, this is biologically my mother. And blood quantum isn't how we do things naturally. It's a lot about kinship and knowledge sharing. And so the way that magic is passed down is through knowledge sharing. Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones is a very good book. So Stephen Graham Jones is like a popular native horror author. He's written things like The Only Good Indians and stuff like that. And this is his only one that I would really recommend to a high school. I haven't read his other ones, but my dad has, and he said that they're pretty horror-y. Like this one's kind of horror-y. It's about so all native people are werewolves, right? And the main characters are like werewolves or indigenous people who are disconnected from their communities. So they're just traveling around, going from one place to another place. So it talks a lot about how community is super important to indigenous people, but also how we are able to survive outside of those communities and still keep our like knowledge systems and culture. Marrow Thieves is great. It's one of the like more popular native books that is out there. I think a lot of people know about it, I think. It's about like these kids who are trying, and these adults who are working together to try and like save themselves against like people trying to capture them and take them away and steal their bone marrow. And I think that it reflects a lot of things that happen to indigenous people, like globally, and like in the United States and Canada, which is where this is set. It's like they describe the places where they took kids to take their bone marrow as schools and stuff like that. And in recent years, I think that more like white people have acknowledged that boarding schools were a thing that happened to indigenous people, but like they have been happening for decades and decades. And they only stopped like 3 decades ago, if that. So I think that it reflects that. It reflects a lot of interesting things about indigenous life, and it really focuses on language preservation, which is really important to me and my family. My dad's a language teacher for my tribe, and I'm trying to relearn my language because a lot of it has been taken from us through boarding schools and a lot of other effects of colonization. This is a book that I recommend literally anyone who lives in Iowa read. I think that it's super important to know whose land you are on, because this is not our land, it's not my land, my people aren't from Iowa. And Lance Foster is a super good source because he's a part of the Iowa tribe, and he's done a lot of work with these people. Like in the acknowledgements for this book, there's like 1 million different people, and he's worked with a bunch of different tribes, and he's really well researched. And he doesn't just say, oh, these people were here, these people were there. He talks about how they moved through time, because that's another thing. Like the Meskwaki, who are the only native tribe here in Iowa right now, were not originally from Iowa. So you need to really think about it as a shifting thing, because as people were pushed west, people took their places and more and more and more. So you need to understand the like changing history of like who was here. And it also talks about their ways of life and how they existed, and I think that's super important. And it talks about who they are now, which is also important because we're not gone.